I guess I've been saying this more than once, but one of the greatest Americans, certainly true in this case, Jane Addams, Addams, like the family, not like the presidents. And then she did come from an eminent American family, which is relevant to her career. What a remarkable person, an intellectual, activist, sort of idealistic projector, charity worker, founder of Hull House in Chicago, associate of John Dewey, among others. Maybe she radicalized Dewey a little bit. Maybe Jane Addams is in there in Dewey's sort of later conceptions of democracy and Dewey's own social activities, I think, partly inspired by Jane Addams. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. A lot of the people we've talked about ain't going to win no Nobel because they're just too radical, okay? And they're anti-statism or whatever. And maybe we'll finish off with trying to deal with her quasi-anti-statism. Okay, but she, yeah, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. I guess I was reading Wikipedia, which says, pretty quotish here, that she was the most revered woman in America when she died in 1935. How about that? Okay, especially for an anti-war activist, but she did so much else as well. Just to talk about Hull House for a second, I'm reading this using this Jane Addams reader, edited by Jean Bethke Elstein, the late Jean Bethke Elstein, quite a good political philosopher and stuff. I guess Vanderbilt. She spent much of her career. She starts out the book like this: Hull House firsts. First social settlement in Chicago. First social settlement in the United States with men and women residents. For one thing, immigrant people, resettlement. Established first public baths in Chicago. Established first public playground in Chicago. Established first gymnasium for the public in Chicago. Established the first little theater in the United States. Can that be right? Chautauqua's, I don't know, man. Established first citizen preparation classes in the United States. Established the first public kitchen in Chicago. Established first college extension course in Chicago. Established first group work school. Established first painting loan program in Chicago. Where like Art Institute masterpieces could get out into the community in some way. Established first fresh air school in Chicago. Established first public swimming pool in Chicago. Established first Boy Scout troop in Chicago. Initiates investigations for the first time in Chicago of truancy, typhoid fever, cocaine, children's reading, newsboys, sanitation, tuberculosis, midwifery, infant mortality, social value of the saloon. Social value of the saloon. She's doing sociology as well as amazingly effective activism, like just devoted to achieving social transformations. Initiates investigations that led to the creation of a first model tenement code. First Illinois factory inspector was Hull House resident, the well-known figure Florence Kelley. First probation officer. Labor unions organized at Hull House include women shirt makers, Dorcas Federal Labor Union, women cloak makers, Chicago's women's trade. Just an incredible person. Right. Now, as a pacifist, she comes by it honest. She might have heard it first by reading Tolstoy. And she went and met Tolstoy. She describes the conversation as somewhat disappointing, I think. But nevertheless, I mean, again, like Tolstoy as the connective fabric of many of these, between many of these figures and ideas, and also Tolstoy as a transitional figure, bringing this kind of 19th century, largely American pacifism into the 20th century, right? And connecting with people like Gandhi. All right, so Jane Addams was a peace activist in the lead up to World War I. We've seen this with William James a little bit. Like he comes out of the anti-imperialist stuff from the 1890s, all right? But James dies before World War I, or even maybe before the obvious preparations were underway. World War I is a pacifist kind of nightmare in a lot of ways. I mean, it's a nightmare in every respect, I suppose you'd say. People watched helplessly as all these countries militarized to the max, got more and more, nationalistic / patriotic, started manufacturing motives for warfare and all this stuff. And Jane Addams tried to stop it, took a serious shot at stopping World War I before it started, founding the Women's Peace Party and other organizations, and touring the world. I mean, going to Europe to organize women for peace before World War I. She was the kind of person who got an audience with the Pope. She's the kind of person who thought of Woodrow Wilson as a friend. Okay. And as she's doing this, particularly like a women's movement for peace, lots of American and world politicians are going with her. Wilson told her that he was a pacifist. He agreed with her. And he would do anything to keep America out of war. She was unbelievably betrayed by all those people, and particularly Wilson. And her notion, and we're going to see this in Randolph Bourne too, the idea of Wilson, in her account, persuaded himself to to go to war, involve America in the First World War, because he fooled himself and fooled the public with this war to end all wars thing, war for the safety of democracy thing or whatever. But in fact, all right, war to end all wars, I guess so, because there doesn't seem to be any particular occasion, except kind of competitive idiocy among the governments of the world. And like I say, she really tried to stop that. She moved, she went to England with peace groups, toured Europe, went to talk to kings and prime ministers all over Europe, and on her own account, of course, failed. Okay. Now, not only that, but she's a friend of Wilson's. Wilson's telling her he agrees with her in all this. She's meeting kings and popes and stuff like this. She's a top kind of society person, and people take her seriously. But as World War I gets going, comes to be, pacifism gets treated tantamount to treason. Okay, and people are getting exiled, imprisoned throughout the war for even advocating resistance to conscription, but even just advocating peace in a radical way, in a principled way, could get you in prison in the United States during World War I. And also, there were very few successful, or none, conscientious objectors in World War I. There were many people who objected. I might just have political objections, like, what the fuck are we doing? All right, like, not this war, buddy. All right, but the way they treated conscientious objectors in World War I was to imprison them or put them into forced labor, or to force them to do kind of not directly killing things in the army and shit like that, okay? So World War II was actually more sensible for conscientious objectors. Maybe that's because in World War II, everyone was a lot more secure about the justice of their cause. Whereas we're going to have to repress dissidents to keep the case for this war plausible in public. So in a lot of ways, this is kind of a terrible nadir of pacifism, but it's going amazingly mainstream with Jane Addams, and especially before the war. So this is what it was like to be a peace activist, talking to Wilson and the Pope and the King of Norway or whatever, and then they go to war. From the very beginning of the Great War, she writes, this is a piece called Personal Reactions in the Time of War, from 22. As the members of our group gradually became defined from the rest of the community, our peace group, or the Women's Peace Party and stuff, each one felt increasingly the sense of isolation, which rapidly developed after the United States entered the war into that destroying effect of aloneness, if I may so describe the opposite of mass consciousness. We never ceased to miss the unquestioning comradeship experienced by our fellow citizens during the war, nor to feel curiously outside the enchantment given to any human emotion when it is shared by millions of others. And she was moving writing about this, and not only here, like how hard it was, how lonely it was. At first we were a movement, at first we were respected by leaders and so on, and when the war happened, each of us felt totally alone, isolated from our own nation in this profound way, and also threatened with prosecution and so on, okay? Called traitors. The force of the majority was so overwhelming that it seemed not only impossible to hold one's own against it, but at moments absolutely unnatural, and one secretly yearned to participate in the folly of all mankind. Our modern democratic teaching has brought us to regard popular impulses as possessing in their general tendency a valuable capacity for evolutionary development. Like the popular will is a positive thing overall, or can be. In the hours of doubt and self-distrust, the question again and again arises, has the individual, or a very small group, the right to stand out against millions of his fellow countrymen? Do you have a right as an individual or small group? Is there not a great value in mass judgment and in intuitive mass enthusiasm? Even if one were right 1,000 times over in conviction, was he not absolutely wrong in abstaining from this communion with his fellows? Like, shouldn't we be social? Shouldn't we be cooperating? Shouldn't we be helping our nation? Shouldn't we agree with all these people around us? Like, this is hard fucking work to be a subversive on this one. We could not, however, lose the conviction that as all other forms of growth begin with variation from the mass. That might be even a feature of evolution, right? Variation from the mass. So the moral changes in human affairs may also begin with a differing group or individual, sometimes with the one who at best is designated as a crank and a freak, and in sterner moments is imprisoned as an atheist or a traitor. Don't we owe a lot to people like that? And she's a kind of such an establishment figure in her way that she can say this in defense of her fellow pacifists. So that's one thing she does with pacifism, is talk about how hard it was during World War I. All right. Doubtless many times new possibilities were declared by a man who, quite unconscious of courage, bore the sense of being an exile, a condemned criminal, a fugitive from mankind. Did everyone so feel who, in order to travel on his own proper path, had been obliged to leave the traditional highway? The pacifist, during the period of the war, could answer none of these questions, but he was sick at heart from causes which to him were hidden and impossible to analyze. Like, what is driving this war? He was at time, and why is it unanimous out here? He was at times devoured by a veritable dissatisfaction with life. This got to be just profoundly depressing. No one knew better than we how feeble and futile we were against the impregnable weight of public opinion, the appalling imperviousness of collective belief, the coagulation of motives, the universal confusion of a world at war. She can be a really fine writer. We were well aware that the modern liberal, having come to conceive truth of a kind which must vindicate itself in practice, finds it hard to hold even a sincere and mature opinion, which from the very nature of things can have no justification in works. Like they're condemning us as mere idealists. And she does say at a couple different spots, like, it seems like all Americans are pragmatists. And it seems like our conversation with Dewey, and it seems like our position is useless, at least right now, right? Or we're standing lonely against the whole society, whatever. Like maybe our beliefs can't have any effect, but maybe they can, okay, in the long run. And she's working toward, and this is really her thing too, a League of Nations, a United Nations, a world court and everything. She has this 20th century idea that the world can come together and ban war or work out alternative dispute resolution procedures. All right. Again, that can be a mainstream view, and of course related to all kinds of actual developments, including the actual League of Nations. One thing about her and about her writing about war, especially, is that she is magnificently sensitive to the women's side of the story. And also she feels that the women's side of the story needs to be expressed urgently because all we're getting is men who are just want to fight or whatever, or just love weapons and shit like this and power. Women are having a different experience of war, for one thing. So she says this is her famous address on peace at Carnegie Hall. That tells you how mainstream this person is. She's advocating peace in, 1915, as the war is going on, but we haven't gotten in. And she's giving the address at Carnegie Hall. I would like to say just a word, about the women in the various countries that are at war. The belief that a woman is against war simply and only because she is a woman and not a man, of course, does not hold. In every country, there are many, many women who believe that the war is inevitable and righteous, and that the highest possible service is being performed by their sons who go into the army, just as there are thousands of men believing that in every country. The majority of women and men doubtless believe that. But the women do have a sort of pang about it. Let us take the case of an artist who was in an artillery corps, let us say, and was commanded to fire upon a wonderful thing, say St. Mark's at Venice, or the Dome at Florence, the Duomo, or any other great architectural and beautiful thing. I am sure he would have just a little more compunction, the artist, than the man who had never given himself to creating beauty and did not know the cost of it. And there is certainly that deterrent on the part of the women who have nurtured these soldiers from the time they were little things, who brought them into the world and brought them up to the age of fighting, and then see them destroyed. And she has texts where she interviews women who have lost their kids, or women whose kids have returned from war terrifyingly psychologically damaged. She's writing about that as well. That curious revolt of women against war comes out again and again, even in the women who are most patriotic and who say, I have 5 sons and a son-in-law in the trenches. I wish I had more sons to give. Even those women, when they are taken off their guard, give a certain protest, a certain plaint against the whole situation, which very few men, I think, are able to formulate. All right. All right. So that's a hard job, being a pacifist in World War I. it's been a hard job in all of these wars, and maybe it's a hard job in the militaristic United States. On the other hand, there have been so many pacifists and so many great Americans who were pacifists, and some of them really got some audience. And that is certainly true of Nobel Prize winner Jane Addams. All right. I do think, as I've been arguing, that pacifism, strictly speaking, entails anarchism because government rests on violence, on force, physical force. Right? So what does someone who's very mainstream do with that? Like, in a way, she's really radical, but in a way, she maintains her spot in the mainstream as well. And she's doing this partly because that's what helps her prosecute these, wonderful social work projects and so on. Okay. And keep Hull House alive. She can't afford to be an Emma Goldman anarchist, man. She needs to raise money. She wants some city support and cooperation and stuff like that. She's not going to blow stuff up either because she's a total pacifist. Right? So she's kind of in this negotiating position of being and she writes about this a lot, actually, as being a mainstream person who during World War I, suddenly found her mainstream, marginally mainstream position called treason, called ridiculous, called radical, and all this. Right? But her efforts after the war and through the war and before the war too is to bring the whole society as much as she can and the local government and everything along with her. Right? She's not a Emma Goldman revolutionary, her contemporary Emma Goldman. She's a reformer. And one question she asks every time is, how can I be effective? She thought she was being effective when Woodrow Wilson told her he agreed with her and would never go to war. And she was terribly disappointed. Okay. But all right, so what does someone like that do with the insight that government rests on violence? In fact, and it's pursuing all these wars and shit, okay? And should I reject that whole thing? Lucretia Mott had to answer this. Everyone had to answer this. And a lot of them said, yeah, out of here with that. Addams can't do that in her position. I'm not saying she would do it anyway. This is what she says. It has long been the aim of this government, of ours, and of similar types of government, the world over, to replace coercion by the full consent of the governed, to educate and strengthen the free will of the people through the use of democratic institutions, and you could think of Dewey, and to safeguard even the rights of minorities. So it's the aim of our government, as stated in various documents and stuff like this, to become a true social contract and cease to rest or not rest on violence and coercion. The rise of democracy and republicanism in the modern world. The conception of the consent of the governed, which sounds anything but coercive, right? It's not compatible with coercion, which is why no one has ever consented to the rule of any government, because consent is incompatible with a coercive force being exercised, threatened against you. All right. But anyway, she wants to read like the ideal of democracy as the ideal of a real social contract in which the government really does rest on consent and participation and not on coercion and imprisonment and conscription and shit like that. All right. This age-long process of obtaining the inner consent of the citizen to the outward acts of his government, the whole history like of Western political philosophy, you could say, or a lot of it was British anyway, is of necessity violently interrupted and thrown back in war times. The governments become much more oppressive in war times. Never has that been more obvious than in the U.S. during World War I, Espionage Act, alien enemies, deporting, repressing speech, imprisoning people like Eugene Debs. Oh my God. But we all realize that someday it must be resumed, like a true contractual democratic vision, and carried forward again, perhaps on an international basis, like where we all consent to maybe even a world government. She talks about world government a lot. Now that does fill me with chills, but I mean, but what she means is pretty mellow. Let us strive to keep our minds clear regarding it. Some of us once dreamed that the cosmopolitan inhabitants of this great nation might at last become united in a vast common endeavor for social ends. Like a true social contract, a true social unity, not resting on the threat of incarceration or whatever. We hope that this fusing might be accomplished without the sense of opposition to a common enemy, which is an old method of welding people together, better fitted for military than for social use. If this is for the moment impossible, let us at least place the spirit of cooperation above that of bitterness and remember the wide distinction between social control and military coercion. Right, so for example, like you can do informal social controls, like we're all subject to all kinds of social pressures, and that's one reason we don't act antisocial and everything. And maybe some things like that could eventually replace militaristic coercion, which is what she's saying the U.S. government so palpably leans on, even though its rhetoric is just the opposite. But we could hope that in the long run, the U.S. and maybe the whole world could be more real about this rhetoric. Like if you're saying that the legitimacy of government rests on the consent of the governed, okay, well that's incompatible with a coercive state, all right? But it is an ideal expressed in the founding documents and in the philosophy of Locke and stuff, you know? So a true realization of the ideals, even of this country or whatever, could yield a government that does not rely on military violence and coercion and incarceration to achieve social unity, or a simulation of social unity. All right, well, that is the very great Jane Addams. I mean, we were really on some mainstream figures, too, in a lot of ways, too, with James and Addams, you know, nationally known, nationally beloved figures. That's cool. That's interesting. And we'll get back out into more radical ones as we go on, as well as other stuff. All right. I researched, for decades, I worked on those early 19th century figures, and I researched them all, and I mean, basically because of their anarchism, not their pacifism. The 20th century figures, I know less, and I'm having to research. That's one reason it's been a week, because I've just had to go read a whole lot of Jane Addams. Next, I think Randolph Bourne, also dealing with World War I.